Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to my colleagues here in Australia. Welcome to the Australia-Brazil Alumni Leadership Conference, co-hosted by the Embassy of Australia in Brazil and the Australian National University. Pouquinho de português, porque nós estamos no Brasil. A Embaixada esse ano apresenta essa série de webinars em parceria com a Australian National University, a universidade número 1 do país, de acordo com o ranking QS. Ao longo dessa semana e da próxima, a ANU vai trazer especialistas renomados mundialmente para apresentações que vão apoiar o seu desenvolvimento pessoal. My name is Ana Paula, and like you, I'm part of the Brazilian alumni community, and I'll be the moderator of tonight's session. As Australian alumni, many of you will remember that we usually begin our meetings with an acknowledgement of country. Therefore, we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders, past and present. Before I pass the word to Matthew Johnston, Counselor of Education and Science at the Australian Embassy, I would like to mention some quick housekeeping rules for our session this evening. This webinar is being recorded and may be broadcasted on ANU TV and on YouTube. We encourage your participation. We have a nice audience tonight, and we encourage you to participate. Even though your cameras and microphones have been disabled for now, there are several ways you can show your interest and interact with our panelists. If you wish to ask a question or speak, please use the raise your hand function on Zoom and we will unmute you. We can also enable your video. You can use the Q&A function for posting your questions. So on the bottom of your screen, there is an option of Q&A. Just click there and you can type your question to our panelists. And you can use the chat to send comments. After the panelists deliver their presentations, 2 attendees will speak about their own experience here in Australia. With that said, I would like to invite Matthew Johnston from the Embassy of Australia to say a few words for us.
Thank you very much, Ana Paula. Boa noite a todos lá no Brasil. A very warm welcome to the 2020 Alumni Leadership Conference, a little different to the ones we have held in previous years. As I'm sure you all know, this has been a relatively extraordinary year for the world and as well for Australia. And we've all had to make some fairly radical adjustments to how we live our lives, how we interact with each other, how we conduct our business. So we're very pleased today to be partnering with the Australian National University to run our alumni webinar series. It's the first time that we have done this. So I thank you all very much for your patience and in particular for the great partnership from the Australian National University who have provided us with a really very rich and interesting seminar series showcasing many great leaders from the university who are experts in their fields to share their experiences with you to aid all of your professional development. The Australia-Brazil Alumni Network is one that is quite large and is always growing largely from the strong interest of Brazilians in studying in Australia, but also I think because of some of the very strong similarities between our two countries and our cultures. I'm very pleased to have been associated with the Alumni Network and to have met many of you face-to-face when we used to have a world where we could meet face-to-face in past years. And we're really pleased to be able to start these series with the ANU. And I think this will be a model that we'll take forward for future activities to strengthen our alumni leadership network. I don't have to tell you all, but our alumni are very important to both Australia and Brazil and all our education institutions as well between both countries. The linkages that you will make from either your time of having studied or lived in Australia and being back in Brazil, or if you're still forming and making your life here in Australia, these linkages are really critical for strengthening a mutual understanding between our two countries and finding opportunities to grow that relationship even more. Well, that's enough from me today. I want to say I hope you are all safe and well, whether you are in Brazil or in Australia. And I hope you are surviving this global pandemic, and I know you would be, with grace and aplomb. So thank you very much, Ana Paula, and for the ANU for allowing me to speak this morning or this evening. And I hope you enjoy the first of the 6-part seminar series. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And looking at the lineup of specialists we have for this series, I'm pretty sure, our guests will love it. Tonight, we are talking about values-based leadership and the elements of successful leadership that create motivated teams. So definitely something that is essential in today's work relations and as a society as well. We will watch the presentations of Professor Gretchen Gagel and Dr. Sally Curtis from the Research School of Management at the ANU, and we'll have the participation of some alumni as well. So if you have any questions for our speakers, just reminding you that you can send it via the Q&A button on your screen. Professor Gagel, it is a pleasure to have you here, and you are our first speaker this evening in Brazil, this morning in Australia. Feel free, please, to introduce yourself and present to our lovely guests.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this presentation today. I'm just going to go over and share my screen. I think it's a little bit important to give you all a little bit of context. I am Dr. Gagel, by the way. I did do the crazy thing of getting my PhD later in life, but just to give you a little bit of context of my point of view that I bring about leadership and change. I started out in engineering and actually went and did an MBA in finance after that. So I've been very kind of analytical and quantitative in my studies, but I've spent most of my time in managing positions, president of consulting firms, and really trying to help my clients implement change. And at the age of 50, I decided to go back and do my PhD in leadership and change because I really wanted to deeply understand the research behind how you effectively lead and implement change. So that's kind of my perspective. 30 years, really 35 years of running manufacturing facilities. Most of my strategy work's been in construction and engineering. I'm currently managing director of a global strategy firm for Asia Pacific and have my own company here in Australia. So love kind of deeply understanding the theory of leadership and change, but then really practically understanding how to make that happen in the real world. So hopefully my comments will mix those two streams of thinking. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the ever accelerating speed of change. So it seems, Matthew, I really appreciate your comments about the global pandemic that we're experiencing. And if we ever had to have a discussion about disruption and what disruption means as far as leaders and trying to understand, but the speed of change has been increasing over time. And this is a US-based chart, but we could do the same thing in any country. What this chart shows is that it took 46 years for 25% of Americans to adopt electricity. I kind of joke, you know, people are sitting around with their candles saying, I don't really think this electricity thing is going to take off, but we had to build the infrastructure, the massive infrastructure to enable people to have access to electricity. And you can see that the television, it only took 26 years for 25% of the population to adopt it. Now we're at the mobile phone at 13, the web at 7, and the smartphone at 3. There's a great book by a gentleman named Eric Topol, T-O-P-O-L, called The Patient Will See You Now. And he actually uses this chart in the front of the book to explain that how technology has accelerated change, that we haven't had a disruption like we had with smartphones since the printing press. Pre-printing press, people didn't have access to information. That broadened the access to information, and now we all have smartphones and have lots of knowledge at the tip of our fingers. So when you think about leadership, and I want you to really deeply think about, it's a word we use constantly. What does it really mean? What does leadership mean? And I go back to this seminal book by James McGregor Burns on leadership. It was written in 1978. And I love this quote about leadership. Leadership over human beings is exercise when persons with certain motives and purposes. So if you're a Simon Sinek fan, or lots of people out there start with why, that we have a purpose. We have something we're trying to achieve. James McGregor Burns grounds a lot of his conversation in politics and military. Obviously, those are two areas where we're trying to win. We're trying to win a battle. We're trying to win in politics, but we have something we're trying to achieve in the world, right? And then we mobilize resources. We mobilize institutional, political, psychological, and other resources to arouse, engage, and satisfy the motives of followers. So leadership doesn't happen in a vacuum. We've definitely migrated from more of a trait-based thinking about leadership to leadership as a process. And leadership doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen if you don't have followers. But we have to satisfy the motives of the followers. Sometimes as leaders, we think we need to satisfy our own motives, but people don't do things if they're not motivated to do them. I don't know if any of you out there have ever thought, oh my gosh, I have this great idea, and people just aren't getting on the bandwagon. In order to realize goals mutually held by both leaders and followers. So purpose and alignment, that's that alignment conversation that the leaders and the followers really are aligned in their thinking. And this goes back to Cotter. This chart actually comes out of another great book, Peter Nordhaus, on leadership, but management versus leadership. And there are academics that will argue that there shouldn't be a separation. But for me, most of us wear both of these hats, but that management is kind of making order out of chaos. It's about planning and budgeting and allocating resources and schedules and implementation plans. Whereas leadership can at times be a little bit about making chaos out of order. It's really deeply embedded in reflection and thinking about, creating that vision and what's that big picture. So I use this acronym SAM, setting direction, setting the strategy. Where is the boat going? And then aligning, once again, that alignment, that people understand the priorities and that their actions are aligned with those priorities. And then motivating and inspiring people to take action. That is one of the most challenging things about leadership. So as we think about leading and change, that's what I was asked to come here and speak about, because, and part of the reason that I went to do my PhD, and I'm going to stop share for just a moment here, is that it is all about change. And I asked Edgar Schein one day, was doing a podcast with him, noted MIT academic on culture. And I said, what is your definition of leadership? And he said, leadership is all about finding things that need to be different and implementing change. That's what leadership is. It's not about the leader, it's an action. We're all demonstrating leadership when we find things that need to be changed and we implement something in a different way. So if you think back to basic change theory, this is Lewin, 1947. Lewin came along with this, this thinking about change that at the time was a bit revolutionary, because what he said is before we're going to implement the change, we actually have to think about creating organizational readiness to change. And this is this unfreezing part of it, that the organization is stuck. The organization is stuck in their way of thinking about things, and before we're going to be able to change anything, or society. I love that Sally, she's going to be talking more about societal change, which is another thing I'm really passionate about, but that we get stuck in our way of thinking about things. I mean, look at this global pandemic, right? There are companies, CEOs that I'm talking to, that entire divisions have gone virtual, that they said that could never be done. We could never do that. That will never work. And guess what? We're making it work. So we have to change, and then we have to refreeze. And then John Cotter came along with this 8-step model of change, which has a lot of similarity about creating the climate for change, that we have to create urgency. You'll hear this term burning platform. That's what the pandemic created for us, right? It's much easier to implement change when there's an obvious burning platform reason to change. When we had to change at ANU to teaching virtually, that you form coalitions and you, once again, this vision, back to James McGregor Burns, that you're creating a vision of where are you headed? What is the end goal? What are we trying to accomplish? And then you engage people. I like to say that we bake the potato together. I don't know what the Brazilian, I joke here in Australia that it would be, and I am in Australia, I've been here 2 years, that baking the meat pie together, but how do you create engagement so that people really buy into the why of why we need to change, and that they're empowered to take action. And that we build on that change and make it part of the culture. So that's the freezing part, back to Lewin. Now there's two really more modern, I say modern, they both started in the early 90s, thinking about change. And the reason that we're thinking about change in a different way is that these models assumed that we would have stability, then some disruption would happen, we would change in reaction to that disruption, and then we would have stability again until the next disruption happened. Well, the disruptions are happening faster and faster. When you think about it, we are in medical disruption. We are in economic disruption. In the United States, we're in political disruption. And I'm not sure what that next landing pad of stability is going to look like. So the two streams I'm going to talk about are organization ambidexterity and organization agility. So ambidexterity is some thinking that started with a Professor March, and it really talks about making deliberate decisions where you exploit your current business model and then explore your future business models, which sounds pretty simple when you say it out loud. What I find in my consulting is that organizations are not making deliberate decisions about the allocation of resources. That's why I put the poker chips here. How many poker chips do we put in our current business model versus our future business model? So you can think of, a medical organization, and they're seeing patients in person. But so that's exploiting our current business model. We see patients in person. But hey, we can have patients, doctors talk to patients virtually. And even pre-pandemic, experimenting with doctors chatting with patients, or doctors having virtual meetings with patients. So that's that new business model that we should be exploring, and how do we allocate resources to that new business model. So that's very much, so you can think within your own team and your own organization, how do we effectively exploit our current business model and incrementally improve that? But what does R&D look like? Like, how are we thinking the unthinkable as far as our future business models? The other stream, which I dug very deeply into in my PhD, is agility. And this is a great book, The Agility Factor. When agility really started out as a stream thinking about software development. So you might have heard of Agile, the Agile Manifesto in software development. It's been successful in revolutionizing software development, but there are people, Linda Holbesch in England and Pamela Meyer in Chicago and Worley Williams and Lawler, thinking about, regardless of the industry, how are we nimble? And they define this agility as a dynamic capability that allows an organization to make timely, effective, and sustained responses to environmental changes. It's more than good management. And Chris Worley talks about change as a muscle. This is what I went back to study in my PhD. How do you as a leader create this nimble culture? We know that things are going to happen. We certainly didn't anticipate that a pandemic was going to happen, but we know there's going to be technology changes, political changes, economic cycles. How do we create this change-ready, nimble organization? And they based their research looking at 400 organizations from 1980 to 2012 that had a return on assets, an ROA, that was greater than the industry mean more than 80% of the time. So that's the proxy that they use for agility. Like if we must be able to shift our products and services to have that kind of sustained financial performance. And they studied these organizations and found 4 agile routines. And they actually, if you Google it, they have a questionnaire, or you can reach out to me, Gretchen Gagel, and I love linking into people around the world, by the way. They have a short form, 19 questions that you can use to assess your agility in the presence of these 4 routines. So agile strategizing, how do we broadly engage the organization in developing our strategy, but then communicating it so that we're all in alignment? Because if we're all aligned, then we can make shifts faster, right? We can react to environmental changes. Agile perceiving is that process of being a flat organization and perceiving as many things as possible in the environment that are going to cause us to need to change. But it's not just perceiving them, it's feeding them into the decision-making process effectively so that we can make good decisions based on what's happening in our business environment. Then agile testing, how we set up and run tests. Now, this is the lowest scoring routine in any research study that I've read utilizing this framework for agility. We don't assign adequate resources to the test. That's the most typical challenge. We'll say, hey, Sally, Bob, and Joe, on top of your normal job, we want you to try to implement this. And so we don't really know if it failed. Did it fail because we didn't do, it's not the right thing to do, or did it fail because we didn't have enough resources? And then how we implement. So back to that medical example, if we're going to have doctors chatting, that's a massive training. I mean, you look at just in ANU going from teaching in person to teaching virtually almost overnight. I mean, really within 2 weeks, the skill development that had to happen with our professors, et cetera. I studied 47 corporations in my dissertation research and measured leadership and agility in 126 business units. These were all primarily global organizations with more than 1,000 employees. And these are the 4 leadership behaviors that I found to support agility. Leadership behaviors that are exploratory, that makes sense, right? That we support a culture of discovering new ways to solve problems, that we really encourage people to explore, have wonder. We talk about at Conversant, my company, to have wonder and awe about what we could do differently. The latitude leadership behaviors were a little bit more surprising to me because it was having a real hands-off leadership process, almost to the point like I'm not available as a leader, but really letting employees work through their own issues and feeling very empowered and autonomous. Visionary, that leaders create a clear purpose and vision of the why we exist. Because if people clearly understand the boundaries of why we exist, then they have freedom to play within that and think about different models and different strategies. And then being really reflective, leadership behaviors, causing the leader to challenge their own assumptions. We talk a lot in my leadership courses about bias. We all have bias. When you think someone throws out an idea and you say, that'll never work, that is bias. So these are the leadership behaviors that support agility. The leadership behaviors that did not support agility were being overly structured. Now, it's not a bad thing to discuss in specific terms who's responsible for what, but if you're locking people into their roles and responsibilities and, just all you do is meet your expectations, and especially this keeping track of mistakes, it creates fear. You have low psychological safety. If you're an Amy Edmondson fan, her book, Fearless Organization, is a great book. She's at Harvard about how we create psychological safety. People don't feel like they can explore or share, hey, I don't think this is working. And then power leadership behaviors where it's not a bad thing to have power and confidence, but if you have so much power and confidence that you're kind of steamrolling over people and not giving people latitude to think in a different way. It's really been awesome. I know that's a kind of a download on thinking about leadership and change in a team and an organizational, and it'll be really great to tie into Sally thinking about how this applies in changing the world and making the world a better place. I would invite you, I have on the screen here my podcast, Greatness, which I actually have a podcast with Amy Edmondson now that I think about that, and Edgar Schein. I'm constantly seeking out the top academics in the world to have these. In fact, Michael Platow, Platow from ANU, is one of the podcasts also talking about identity theory when it comes to in-group, out-group, and thinking about leadership. So please do link into me and let me know what you thought about my comments today. I'll leave it there if we have any questions.
Thank you, Doctor. And we do actually have some questions from the audience. So one of our guests asked how to use agile strategies for a national research center. I got the impression that research centers are a bit less agile, even though they have cutting edge knowledge and technology.
Yeah, it's really interesting in my study. I had government agencies in my research study, large government agencies, and some of them had very agile business units, even if the overall organization culture can be a little bit more bureaucratic. It is definitely, you can, as a leader, create this within any organization. One of them is highly bureaucratic with a very agile business unit in the middle. So those leader behaviors, starting with that assessment around agility, thinking about how am I giving people the freedom to try things, removing fear of failure, et cetera. And especially in research, I mean, that's what you're doing in a research center is trying to research, new things happening.
Yeah. Our guest is also asking how to encourage companies to look for research in moments like this one, like a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. To look for research on how to be agile, research in leadership and change, et cetera.
I believe to look for maybe new ideas or innovation.
Ideas. Yeah, engaging everybody, and it's the people they've found over and over, it's the people on the front line that actually have most of the new ideas. It's not the bosses, it's the people that are interacting with your customer base or et cetera. So really engaging them. I did a company turnaround. We turned around a failing company in 9 months, and we engaged 800 employees in really thinking about the new business models and how we were going to do business in a different way. So sometimes we think the leaders need to lock themselves away in a room and figure this all out. And really, the more broadly you can engage all the diverse thinking in the organization, that's where your ideas are going to come from.
Mm-hmm. Another question that came, and I believe inspired by the situation we are living through the pandemic, the leadership subject is a very commonplace in the business environment and its related professions, but it's not discussed at all in healthcare professions. Any thoughts about this?
So we actually have a global client in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, France, Singapore, and Australia, and New Zealand. That's a healthcare organization that has created a leadership institute. And I do think that medical organizations are starting to understand, once again, leadership is not about the leaders. Leadership is an action that we all take formally and informally to identify ways to do things, to inspire people, to motivate, to execute patient care, et cetera. So I'm hopeful. And this book, The Patient Will See You Now, is really a great book to think about disruption in healthcare and how we're going to need more leadership.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about this, where leadership happens in hierarchy, we have a question exactly about that. One of our guests just asked, you talk Dr. Gagel, you talked about management versus leadership. Is there a hierarchy or a point in our organization where leadership should take priority, or should leadership be encouraged at every level of an organization?
Definitely every level. So I have people that I work with, teams. I have people draw a circle and put however many hours they work a week and think about what percentage of time do you spend as a subject matter expert? So that's how we're usually hired. You're an engineer, you're a marketing person. What percentage as a manager and what percentage as a leader currently? And then to think about ideally what should that look like? And almost I would say 95% of the time, people feel they should be spending more time on leadership. But leadership is difficult because it's not task oriented. It's not checking a box. Sometimes leadership's sitting in a room by yourself with a pad of, piece of paper and really thinking about, gosh, how is my team doing? And reflecting and thinking, you got to stop chopping down the trees to look at the whole forest. But that takes time and reflection. I really miss my airplane time every week because that's my reflection time. I've got to figure out how to find new reflection time. So it does come from everybody, and whatever that mix is different for different people and different organizations. But it's figuring out what the right mix is for you, and then carving that time out to affect the action of leadership.
All right. We have a question. Other than The Patient Will See You Now, if I could read one of accessible books on leadership this weekend as a relatively early career manager, which one would you recommend?
This is going to sound like a strange recommendation, but it's called Search Inside Yourself. It's by a Google engineer whose name I can either remember names of books and Sally's probably, as a PhD, you're very focused on people's names and their research, but I'm not recalling it right now. But Search Inside Yourself brings in a lot of the mindfulness and emotional intelligence and reflection about life in general. And I think that's the thing I'm continuing to understand, why I rehired my emotional intelligence coach, is that it's about this ability to understand who you are and grow as a person that makes you great at leadership. And so Search Inside Yourself, it's definitely one of my favorite books. Well researched.
And our next question sounds like it's coming from someone who has a boss, not a leader, because it sounds like this person was not searching inside themselves.
Yeah.
The question is how to deal with a boss that is not a good leader, as in a boss that doesn't set clear directions. I had this experience last year, and it was very hard to understand how to prioritize tasks, and I felt quite lost.
Yeah.
So how this person can help herself in that environment?
My first note is just make a note of what they do that you don't like and don't do that. I've learned some of my best leadership from working from that with and observing bad leaders. And try, back to Stephen Covey. Here's another great book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Sorry, I almost threw it. He does have an 8th habit in another book, but 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Focus on your sphere of influence. What can you influence? How can you upwardly influence this person? How can you sit down with them and ask about the priorities and ask for clarification? Because your influence will grow. If you focus on things outside of your sphere of influence, it causes a lot of frustration. You're not going to change this person probably, but how can you influence them? How can you be a great team member? And how can you exhibit leadership actions?
All right. Just reminding
wonderful questions.
They are good, right? Yes. And if you have any questions, please send them on the Q&A. I think I'll pass now to our next speaker of today, just reminding everyone that you can still send your questions here on the Q&A, and we are going back to the questions after the next presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Gagel. Your presentation was excellent. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Sally Curtis from the Research School of Management of ANU. Dr. Sally, welcome to our event this evening. And please, it's your time to take the floor. Introduce yourself to our guests and tell us about leadership and social impact, correct?
Correct. Good evening, everyone in Brazil, and good morning, everyone here in Australia. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So as Ana Paula said, my name is Sally Curtis. I work at the Research School of Management at the Australian National University. And yeah, although we're in kind of strange times at the moment, it's a pleasure to be virtually with you, and otherwise maybe this opportunity wouldn't have presented itself. So I love that we're all finding ways to connect across the world. So I have a background in leadership development with leaders who work in for-purpose leaders, I guess we could call them. So leaders who are really looking to make a social impact beyond financial profits and financial gains. Although in some cases, obviously that's very important as well. So I have a practical background in leadership development, and then I had a question once from a scientist leader that I was working with who asked me about the evidence for some of what I was teaching in a leadership course. And that was over a decade ago now, but it got me thinking about this question of evidence and whether what we teach is actually evidence-based and whether it actually makes a difference. So from there, I went on to explore that question and do a PhD, and became very passionate about research and the connection between evidence and using evidence in organizations to make decisions. And so the question that somebody asked from the healthcare sector about leadership in the healthcare sector is in the healthcare sector, where we're using similar to what they do in medicine, in evidence-based practice in clinical decision making, looking at what the evidence tells us about how to manage people and leaders in the organization. So I look specifically at social innovation and kind of taking an evidence-based practice approach. What I'm going to share with you today, and I, the challenge, of course, of being virtual is that I don't get to learn much from the audience, which I generally really enjoy doing. But I'll try and make it a little interactive. But what I'm going to present is, about 20 minutes of a 12-week course that I teach on social impact. And so I'm going to try and make it as practical as possible, and just give you a bit of a taster, I guess, as to the way this connection between the nexus of leadership and social impact. But bear in mind that there's a whole lot more that comes with looking at this topic. So look, let me share my screen. There we go. So sharing my screen now. Let me get started with, of course, thinking about what I'm talking about when we look at social impact. So it's really important that we have a common understanding of what I mean by this. So I'm going to take a definition that's provided by the University of Michigan, where they define social impact as simply a significant positive change that addresses a pressing social challenge. Okay, so where Gretchen spoke about change within an organization, what I'm focused on in my research and my teaching is about, and also my practice, is about looking at change and society. So looking at social challenges in particular. So let me give you some examples of what we mean by pressing social challenges. So income inequality is obviously a big social challenge, where there's some evidence to suggest that about 1% of the population have the majority of the world's wealth. And so you see in this map of the world where more inequality exists. So the darker the green, this is a measure of inequality using the Gini index. For those of you who are economists in the room, you'll know this measure. So the darker the green on this map of the world, the more inequality exists in that country. So income inequality is one example. Poverty, a related concept, is another term. So poverty here, again, I've got a map of the world showing that the red and the darker the color again is where there is more extreme levels of poverty in the world. And we estimate that about, or economists estimate that about 1.6 billion people in our world live in poverty. And poverty defined here as a lack of income, but also no education experience, no education opportunities, poor access to health and living standards. In Australia here locally, we have issues around Indigenous disadvantage. Our Indigenous peoples here in Australia have a shorter life expectancy than non-Indigenous people. They have higher rates of infant mortality, poorer health outcomes, and also lower levels of education and employment. A couple of other examples: homelessness and domestic violence. So these are all examples of some of the pressing social challenges, I guess, that I'm thinking about when we explore this issue of leadership and social impact. So what I'd like to do is, in an attempt to make this a little interactive, is I'm hoping that you have access to a smartphone or a computer, and that you can log into this address on a platform called Poll Everywhere. So if you type into your web browser, polllev.com/Sally Curtis 977. If you type that into your browser, I'll give everyone a minute or so to grab their smartphone and type that into the browser. And I'll look to my technical support to tell me if we're having any problems. I hope everyone can type that in. And what you'll see as I flick to the next slide is a question that should pop up on your device that says, trying to get a sense here of whether you're involved in addressing a social challenge. So it should come up on your screen, I'm hoping. And we should be able to see the results live as we go through here. So I'll just give everyone a few seconds. Okay. A few people changing their mind, not sure. Okay, fantastic. All right, so what I'm seeing is a little over half the group are involved in addressing a social challenge. And of course, this is where I wish we could interact more in person, because I'd love to hear more about what you're up to. Let me now ask the question of if you are involved in a social challenge. So for those 50-odd% of people who responded, yes, you are involved in addressing a social challenge. What is the challenge? Can you type it into your field there and press submit? And it should, it's helping us to develop a word cloud here. I'm seeing a lot of you involved in education. That makes sense given the audience, I understand, is a lot of universities and educational institutions, but a whole range. Climate change, poverty, inequality, health, What else am I seeing? Environmental issues coming up there, racism, COVID, fantastic. Okay. Education being the biggest one. And I'm assuming that that's, well, yeah, we could think about education as a pressing social challenge, and maybe education inequality, or the not as much opportunity for everyone for education. All right, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. That just gives me a sense of what everyone's working on in that half of the group who responded to working on a social challenge at the moment. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Excellent. So I'm going to ask another question in a moment, but one of the things I want to look at is who instigates social impact. And this, of course, is where we look at the nexus between leadership and social impact. So we now have an understanding of what we're talking about with respect to social impact. The question now is who achieves social impact, and who is it who brings about social change. And so in the research and in research that I've done, there are generally kind of three labels that we use. And I guess the labels are helpful to understand, you know, the types of people, and to help us with research in these different categories. So the first category is a social entrepreneur. So these people are people who lead social change from inside organizations. So they could be in a private sector, in business. They could be in the government sector. They could be in NGOs, or indeed they could be in universities. So social entrepreneurs, they are working within the bounds of an organization to make change, particularly social change. The second category of who instigates social impact is the social entrepreneur. So some of you may be familiar with this term. It's kind of started to appear a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. Social entrepreneurs are those people who create their own ventures, social ventures. So they see a problem in the world, a social problem, and they create their own venture to try and solve that problem. And the third category is the system entrepreneur. So the system entrepreneur is focused on leading system change. So let me give you an example of each of these. So this is a woman who I don't expect you to know or be familiar with, but her name is Darcy Winslow. She worked in the late 1990s. She was working in Nike, a company that we all know, I assume. And she was in research and development, working in research and development. And at the time, she was looking at the chemicals that were used in the development and design of Nike's shoes. And so when she looked at the toxic chemicals that they were using, she decided that it wasn't healthy or environmentally safe to be using these chemicals. And so that began for her really a career in looking at sustainable design. And so she started the Sustainable Design Group in Nike. And Nike can now produce a shoe that uses no toxic chemicals or glue. And so she's an example of someone working within an organization, Nike, who saw an opportunity to address the social challenge of environmental degradation and safety. And so she started the Sustainable Design Group at Nike. So that's an example of a social entrepreneur. a social entrepreneur, sorry. A social entrepreneur, an example of a social entrepreneur is, of course, Muhammad Yunus. He's kind of seen as the father of social entrepreneurship. Of course, he started the Grameen Bank, and the Grameen Bank was about making credit and finance available to the poor in Bangladesh. And so he has lots of Grameen banks in rural areas around Bangladesh. And that really started a movement in microfinance and also social business. So we now see a lot of social businesses where the idea is they address a social problem, but they also make a profit. Muhammad Yunus is kind of what most of us think of as the father of social business and microfinance. We then have system entrepreneurs. So an example of a system entrepreneur is the Sustainable Food Lab. So they've been around since 2004. It's an NGO. And what the Sustainable Food Lab does is they get leaders to collaborate and lead change across a system. So in this example, it's the food system and trying to make the food system more sustainable. And, you know, Gretchen talked a lot about leadership not coming from one person. System entrepreneurs are kind of the epitome of a collective approach to leading and bringing about social change. And so the people that you see on the screen here are leaders in Starbucks, in Mars, in lots of big corporations who are actually competing against each other in some cases, but they come together to try and build a sustainable food system and try and put some of their competitive mindsets aside. So they're the three examples of, three categories of leaders who instigate social change. So what I'd like you to do now is tell me if you're one of those people in the 50-odd% who said you're involved in addressing a social challenge, can you tell me which one you are? Are you an intrapreneur, a social entrepreneur, or a systems entrepreneur? Okay, good. All right, so I'm seeing the majority of people are working within the bounds of an organization to lead social change within the organization. A small percentage, about 5%, have your own social venture. I would love to hear what that's about. And we have quite a few actually, about a third of the group are systems entrepreneurs. So that's really interesting to me. So let's go on and look then at, so thank you for that. I want to talk about another category of entrepreneur. This was developed by a woman at Oxford Business School, the Said Business School at Oxford, who do a lot of social entrepreneurship research and teaching. And one of the pieces of research they did is about heropreneurs. And I think, again, this is quite consistent with Gretchen's idea of, you know, it's not one person who's responsible for leading and change. And this really comes out of what we've seen in the research and in practitioner land with respect to social impact and social entrepreneurship, where it's really been, the focus has really been on the leader, the one person that is kind of instigating the change. And so Oxford University came up with this label called the heropreneur, defined as a founder who is greatly admired as if a hero and viewed as the main actor in social progress. A person who starts an organization and who overemphasizes their role as founder, overshadowing teams, collective impact, and building upon the ideas of others. So the idea here is that there are some people operating this space of social impact who make it more about them than about the social change. And this research is suggesting that this approach is not going to have the kind of systems change and the social impact that's required. So it's important that we don't kind of turn people who are working in this social impact space into heropreneurs. So I didn't put this up as an option for you to respond to in the survey. But the idea is here that we don't need heropreneurs. We need people who are collaborative and looking at systems working in this space. So one of the things about social challenges, as those of you who are working in this space will know, is that they are complex. So often there is introductory, incomplete or contradictory knowledge. The number of people and opinions involved or strongly held beliefs about what's right and wrong about a social challenge is often very common. They also carry a large economic burden, so they're worthwhile trying to resolve from an economic standpoint, but also a moral standpoint, obviously. And the other thing about social challenges is that they're interconnected, and so there's lots of kind of sub problems, if you like. So they're very interconnected. And that makes them all of these characteristics of social challenges makes it a very complex problem to be working with. And this is, I guess, why systems thinking is really important. So those people working in the systems entrepreneurship space will know about the importance of systems thinking. So this is a parable that's a pretty common parable that's used when trying to explain what systems thinking is. It's the parable of an Indian parable, actually, of an elephant and blind men going to explore and learn about an elephant. So there are several blind men who go and explore the elephant by just looking and trying to feel what they can about the elephant. So the first blind man walks up to the trunk and says, an elephant is like a snake, because that's what he can feel is the trunk of the elephant. The second blind man is on the back of the elephant and believes that the elephant is like a brush. The third blind man goes up to the elephant and says, the elephant is like a tree trunk. The fourth blind man walks up and grabs the tail of the elephant and thinks the elephant is like a rope. And then the fifth man is off to the side and finds some elephant poo and says the elephant is soft and mushy. And so I guess this is a little bit what social challenges are like. They're social systems, and everyone has a different perspective on the social challenge. And because of those different perspectives, there can sometimes be a lot of conflict in trying to resolve the social challenge. But the idea is that a system leader is needed to understand that social system with respect to the social challenge. That any one perspective is not going to help with solving the problem. And so to really bring about social impact, social challenges, we need to acknowledge that social challenges exist in social systems, and therefore they need system leaders. And so what we're seeing in the research and also in the practice of sort of social impact and those working in this space is much more of an emphasis on this systems approach to trying to solve the issue. So we often see, and in fact I'm working with someone at the moment who has moved from being an intrapreneur to a social entrepreneur to now a systems entrepreneur, because they've realized that in order to make sustainable change in the space that they're working in, they really need to be bringing together a whole lot of partnerships in order to change the system. So what do system leaders do? Well, first they recognize that they're part of the systems that they're seeking to change, okay? And they understand their mindset, and that mindset is not right or wrong. It's just different to the other people and stakeholders who are operating in the system. System leaders also understand the problem and the root causes of the problem. And this is where kind of that using that evidence base as well as a stakeholder perspective to understand the root causes of the problem before jumping to solutions. System leaders also enable collective intelligence and wisdom to merge. So this is to emerge rather. So this is where, you know, the heropreneur is not very effective, because the heropreneur will want it to be about them. Whereas a systems leader will really engage all the stakeholders and stimulate them to come up with the solutions themselves. And as with any leadership pursuit, I think system leaders need to learn by doing. So practice, 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 and reflective learning along the way. So to end, I guess what I have here is kind of leaders and the social impact spectrum. And at one end, I have inclusive team leaders, and I haven't spoken about inclusive team leaders, but I will in a minute. And at the other end, we have system entrepreneurs. Now, what we're starting to see in the research is that the most significant change at a kind of really trying to change social structures and mindsets, where that is occurring is at the system entrepreneur end of the spectrum. But that way of doing things has only really started to emerge in the last few years within the social enterprise sector, social innovation sector. At the other end of the spectrum, I mentioned that I haven't spoken about inclusive team leaders, but for those of you in the group who are not involved in social change, but perhaps you're leading a team, just being an inclusive team leader is a way of making a small impact at a local level, where inclusive team leaders are those who invite and appreciate others' contributions and include others in discussions and decisions in which their voices and perspectives might otherwise be absent. So even regardless of where you are on this spectrum, if you're just leading a team and not involved in a social change yet, there are some things you can do to be more inclusive as a team leader that can actually have a social impact at a smaller level. And for those of you who are working kind of somewhere in the middle of the spectrum or the end, then I'm hoping that you'll ask some questions so I understand a little about what you're doing in this space, because I would love to learn more about that. Because what my presentation hasn't covered is obviously it's not easy. And so I applaud you who are doing work in this space, because I know it's a really challenging space to be in, but also really rewarding. So look, that's all I have for you today. As I said, this was 20 or so minutes of a course that I usually teach that's a lot longer than this, but I hope it's given you kind of some ways of thinking about social impact from a leadership perspective. And I'll hand it over to Anna Paula for questions, and I hope to learn more about what you're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Curtis. And yes, we do actually have some questions. One of them, I believe, has a lot to do with the inclusive leadership you were mentioning, and also how to be a systems entrepreneur. One of our guests is asking how to tackle cultural and language barriers as a leader, especially when you are in a small to middle-sized work environment.
How to tackle language and
cultural barriers.
Yeah. Yeah, really good question. So, you know, it's kind of interesting, and Gretchen might have a perspective on this as well, but, you know, there's this, what I think is a myth around diverse teams, and the research shows this as well. So we often think that diversity equals good, and that diversity is going to bring about high performance and, you know, achieve great things. But in actual fact, diversity is, it can create a lot of rifts within the team, because there are people with different perspectives, different mindsets. And so it's actually the perfect scenario for a lot of conflict to exist. And that's where inclusive leadership actually becomes really important. So I mentioned that I'm currently working on a healthcare project with a healthcare system, not a healthcare organization, but a whole system. And in that, we did a review of all of the evidence about what to do in teams where there's a lot of diversity. So it might be cultural diversity, it might be technical diversity, you know, where there's doctors and nurses and non-technical people in a team. And this healthcare sector, there was a lot of conflict going on. There's a lot of bullying and harassment. But I think it's related to this question. And so what we found, and why I've presented this idea of inclusive leadership, is that what we found, the evidence suggests that inclusive leadership is something that is going to help to manage that diversity in the team, okay? And so it's really important, the leader's role in managing the diversity of a team is even more important in a diverse team than it might be in a more homogenous team. And so, you know, where there's cultural diversity, what I would emphasize is really doing a lot of work in the early stages of the team formation around trying to understand each other, trying to understand the different cultural backgrounds and perspectives that might lead to people behaving in certain ways, and make a space for that and talk about it explicitly, rather than everyone knowing that everyone's a bit different but never actually talking about it. So I'm a big believer in bringing the, you know, if there's a saying in Australia and elsewhere, I know that, you know, the elephant in the room, kind of bringing that out into the open and talking about it, rather than pretending it doesn't exist and trying to have low conflict, but actually that not actually dealing with it will inevitably deal with conflict that's not resolved in a constructive way. So yeah, so I would say an inclusive leadership approach, but also be clear and talk about some of those differences that exist within the team, whether it be cultural diversity, language diversity, and be explicit about having a conversation as a team about how you manage that.
We do have another question here, and it's one of our guests asking for your thoughts on this theme, Dr. Curtis. Some organizations problematize access to education, health, and employment opportunities. But what I see is that most of them do not problematize the structures themselves that are reproducing inequality in the first place. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, It's a very astute question, a very good question, and I assume it's somebody working in this space. So this goes to the issue of power, of course, and you know, one of the things that's very important when we look at leadership is power, and who has power, who has influence, and often the people with power are those who are working in a system that's working very well for them. And so what that means is that they keep reproducing the same results, which often gets some voices left out. And so I think it's a very good question. It's a very astute question. I guess the systems leader approach is an approach that encourages leaders to work collaboratively to resolve an issue. So if the issue is education or access to education opportunities, and that some people are getting left behind with respect to education opportunities, it's a very gnarly, wicked problem to try and solve. And so it's not easy, but the idea of a systems thinking approach, a systems leader approach, is getting all the actors together who have a responsibility for education. And if we think about the elephant analogy, getting all of the different actors to share their perspective on the system, and for everyone to kind of understand that system. And if you look at the food lab example, the NGO that I talked about, that's exactly what they do, that they understand the system from all the different perspectives, whether it's the primary producer in a developing economy, through to all the different businesses who are involved in the food supply chain. And they get all of those actors to look at the elephant, share their perspective of the elephant, and then come in with an open mindset to try and bring about change at a systemic level. But I know that, you know, education inequality is a big, gnarly, wicked issue, and it's sometimes not as easy for that as that. I guess the other thing I would add, and what I'm starting to observe in this space, is that I kind of mentioned this trajectory or career path of social entrepreneurs. And what I'm starting to see is that people will often start as an entrepreneur in an organization. They might move on to be a social, have their own social venture. And they build social capital. They build social capital in the space that they're working in. So if it was education inequality, then they would be building social capital in that space to then be able to work at the systems level, which seems to occur when people are, you know, kind of at their later phases of their career. So that's, I don't know what stage of career people are at in the room, but that's what I'm starting to see happen with people who are working in this space. So social capital, build your social capital in the issue that you're trying to resolve.
Thank you so much. We have some more questions here that I believe I could actually open for both of our speakers. And one of them quite specific, but I think very interesting as well. What lessons on leadership and social impact can we get from the military?
The military, okay. So I haven't studied the military, so that's not something that I've looked at. I've had students who have been kind of studying, who are going back to their home country and working in the military. I guess I'd like to understand from that person more about what they had in mind. So I'd like some context to that question, but I appreciate that might not be possible.
I can jump in while maybe if they're going
Thanks,
to
Gretchen. Yeah.
provide some in there, but you know, James McGregor Burns, as I mentioned, really does his book is founded in political and military leadership, and it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Retired Major General Simone Wilkie in Canberra has become a good friend. She was second in command in Afghanistan of the Australian troops, and has spent her, now retired, with her career in the military. And when she gives lectures in my leadership courses, she points out that we think of military as being very hierarchical, but it has a lot of the same dynamics as a corporation. It's really not that different than corporate America in many ways. But I, like Sally, haven't specifically studied the military, but it's been very insightful to spend time with Simone and really understand leadership dynamics. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from it.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that comes to mind locally here in Australia, you know, one of the issues that has existed in our Defence Force here locally is gender inequality. And, you know, so one of the things that our Defence Force has been trying to tackle is gender inequality, which of course in a male-dominated area has been very challenging, but that's, you know, that's one social issue that our Defence Force here in Australia are really have spent a lot of time working on in the last few years.
And we do have 3 questions here that are quite related, so I'll open it for both of you. We have some guests asking how science leaders can help science regain protagonism now that we have, some of them point out obscurantism, fakeness, and anti-science propaganda. We have a guest that says she's working for leaders who refuse to accept science. And another one that's asking how to inspire the social change when you are a small fish in an organizational behemoth. So I think these are similar issues that if you could address, it would be great.
Gretchen?
Yeah, I mean, the science-based thing, I actually taught evidence-based management last year at ANU, which was a really fascinating, and that's why I went back to get my PhD, was to understand the science behind what I had been doing as a layperson for 25, 30 years at the time. I think that it's an interesting dichotomy because we are all about data analytics now too, right? Big data is a phrase that's used quite often in the US about how we collect and evaluate data to make decisions. And yet socially, I think, at least in the United States, we have polarization around, you know, fake news and things. I sit on the board of Homeward Bound, which is Fabian Dattner's organization that sends 80 women scientists on a boat to Antarctica every year. In fact, I was just watching the documentary about her that's in the Sydney Film Festival right now. And that's, you know, trying to lift up voice, to give voice to people that are giving voice to evidence and science, and, you know, not being deterred by people that aren't believing that you just have to be tenacious and persistent and build, back to Cotter's change model, build alliances. So that's what she's trying to do, is build a network of 1,000 female scientists around the world that have each other as a global support system and platform so that their voices are amplified. So finding ways to amplify voice is really critical and ties into what Sally was talking about with systems.
Yeah, look, I think this is such an important question, and a question that so many science communicators and scientists have pondered. And, you know, I guess we see this with climate change. I'm guessing that's kind of where you're coming from with the climate change deniers, whatever that is, like. And then I think we've also seen it recently as well with COVID. And so if you look at the countries who around the world who seem to have the lower number of COVID cases and who have managed the COVID situation well, it's those leaders in the country who have listened to the experts, and I'm thinking here about, say, Germany, and I think Australia has done this quite well also. They've had their medical experts by their side, listening to the evidence, and so that's given me some hope, actually, because, you know, here in Australia we had bushfires over summer that were the worst bushfires that anyone can remember, and we had a Prime Minister who has not accepted the science on climate change. So we went from a situation over the summer period here in Australia, so over December, January, and even earlier, where we had our political leaders not listening to the science with respect to climate change. And then in the pandemic, it's kind of switched a little and evolved, where our leaders are standing right beside the medical experts and listening to the medical experts. And so that's given me some hope. And I know there's a lot of people now talking about, you know, whether in some places, whether this is a bit of a shift of appreciating and bringing science to front and center when in the decision making. But you know, I think in my work on evidence-based practice, it happens in a social system. And in a social system, there are interests and different perspectives. And so I think one of the things that, you know, in order to influence people, we also need to be able to be influenced ourselves. And so it's really important that those of us who are passionate about science and science-driven decision-making, that we don't become evangelical about it, and we don't become judgmental of others who are not ready to listen to that. But the conversations that we have are conversations that try and understand the other's perspective as well. And I think when we look at climate science and what we've done, what different responses have been to climate science, there's a lot of ideological viewpoints. And so I think that, you know, coming back to that elephant analogy, we need to go into situations and be mindful of different perspectives on an issue in order to be able to influence others. So science is just one source of information. There are a whole lot of other sources of information that play into decision making that we need to consider. But it's a thorny issue.
Definitely it is, yes. And to actually give some incentive to this plurality of voices, we invited some of the alumni to join us this morning here in Australia, this evening here in Brazil. And I would like to invite one of our guests, Carolina Modesto, who studied in the University of Melbourne, to actually share with us a little bit about her experience and leadership here in Australia.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Carolina. Bom dia.
Hi.
Muito bem-vinda. If you could please let us know a little bit about you and your experience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me well? Yes? Perfect. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So good morning for everybody in Australia and good evening, Brazil. I wish I could see your faces. It's a real pleasure, privilege, and honor to be part of our alumni conference today. Thank you so much for having me, and a massive thanks for the Australian Embassy team and the ANU team as well. So before we go any further, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet today, and also pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures, connections, and contributions to our societies. So my name is Carolina. Thanks for the introduction, Ana Paula. I'm from São Paulo, Brazil. And my experience studying, working, and living in Australia has completely changed my life. So after a few years of being interested in education and international development fields, I'm now privileged to have the opportunity to live them every single day. And my journey has started 4 years ago when I was fortunate enough to be awarded an Endeavour Scholarship to study a Master's of Development Studies at the University of Melbourne. The Master's provided me with a really good theoretical grounding and practical experience to debate important issues such as international policymaking, health and development, as well as sustainability, gender issues, and Indigenous development. And having studied in Australia really allowed me to build those relationships and that social capital that Sally was talking about with people from diverse backgrounds, which I think made me a better person, and enter spaces that I'm passionate about, such as education, international cooperation in education, and diversity and inclusion. So I think studying in Australia has really expanded my horizons profoundly, and also opened doors to do an internship at the Australian Red Cross, in which I worked with the international volunteer team. And that experience gave me a more broader perspective of what humanitarian leadership looks like. And after graduating, I was privileged to get a position with Teach for Australia as the recruitment and advocacy manager for the ACT and Queensland. So that's my current job. And for those who are not familiar with Teach for Australia, I'll just give you a quick overview of the organization and what I'm doing there. So Teach for Australia is a not-for-profit organization, part of a global movement called Teach for All. So Dr. Gago might be familiar with Teach for America. We have Teach First in the UK. We have Teach for India, Teach for Malaysia, and Teach for Brazil. So we are part of this global movement dedicated to developing leadership in classrooms and communities to ensure that all kids achieve their potential. And Teach for Australia exists because, unfortunately, Australia's education system is not fair for everybody, and that's not good enough for everybody. Unfortunately, children from the lowest socioeconomic households are on average 3 years behind in schools, and some research shows that Indigenous Australians are on average 6 times more likely to be below the national minimum standards for literacy and numeracy, which is shocking, and it really opened my mind when I started working at TFA. So Teach for Australia seeks to break the cycle of educational inequality to try to level the playing field for young people across Australia. But as Dr. Curtis said, we are part of this movement and we work alongside other actors because such a systemic issue needs a systemic solution. So my work at Teach for Australia is to recruit both graduates and professionals who represent a range of academic disciplines and invite them to join our leadership development program, in which they will be trained as teachers and work in schools serving all socioeconomic communities across the country. So it's a non-traditional pathway into teaching, and the ultimate goal is to build a pipeline of teachers and leaders who hopefully will make an impact in the education system inside and outside the classroom. So just to wrap up, I think moving forward, we require leadership, leadership for creating a better self, leadership for creating a better world, leadership to reshape the institutions to be more equitable, and leadership to reorientate our education system to prepare all of our own people and young and future leaders to shape a better future for everybody. Thank you so much.
I think that was a beautiful wrap up, Carolina. And Dr. Curtis, I think that if you were curious about what some of the people in the audience are doing, we just had a great example here. Someone who seems to be applying the theory of change and actually exercising leadership within communities. Thank you so much for your participation, Carolina. And I would also like to thank you very much, Dr. Gago, Dr. Curtis, for their presentations today. And Matthew, would you like to say a few words before we wrap up?
Yes, thank you very much, Ana Paula and parabéns, Carol. It was an excellent wrap up, I think, for this discussion, and really brought home some really good examples from our two speakers in your work. So congratulations. Thank you very much, Dr. Gagel and Dr. Curtis, for your time today and for sharing your insights. I found it really deeply very interesting as well from my own professional and personal development. So thank you very much for sharing your insights, and I hope all of our alumni have enjoyed this session today. So thank you very much, everyone, for your hard work and for your participation, and for the amazing and very insightful questions from our extremely intelligent alumni group. It was very impressive. So thank you very much for everyone for your time, and boa noite para todos no Brasil.
Wonderful.
Boa noite a todos. Muito obrigada. Oh, please, Dr. Gagel, Dr. Curtis, please, if you want to say something.
I just want to say thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, likewise, it's a pleasure to be here. And if I could just give a plug for a webinar series that I'm involved in coordinating on social innovation, and it's called the Social Innovation Conference, or CCON. What I might do is send you, hopefully through Matthew, maybe some details about the webinar series that'll happen late July. So it'll be talking to a whole bunch of people involved in social change. So I'll be in conversation with a social systems entrepreneur who's really pivoted in COVID times and is doing a lot in this area of systems change. So Matthew, I might send you the details, and if you could distribute it.
Please, we're happy to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So here at the Australian National University, we do have a team dedicated to engagement with Brazil. If you would like to know more about the relationship between ANU and Brazil, please contact Daniel Brown. That was our amazing co-host. He was in the background replying to some of your questions. Just contact him and he can inform you about all things ANU. If you have inquiries about admissions or how to study at the university, contact me. My name is Anna, and I'll be happy to talk to you as well. Tomorrow at the same time, we will be here again to discuss the importance of leadership in the energy transition and sustainable well-being futures. So thanks for joining us today e até logo. Boa noite a todos. Tchau, tchau.